Hello friends and welcome back to the Jank Diver Gaming channel. Today we're re-entering the Mobster world with our Unrestricted Cube update for Streets of New Capenna. If you're new to the set, just imagine Ravnica but with more references to The Godfather. For us, we're taking a look at all the new cards from the set that we'll be testing out in our own digital arena cube with a brief explanation of why we're interested in each card. It's worth noting real quick, as we did with the Peasant Cube update, that New Capenna is a heavily focused 3-color set, and our design goals and philosophies don't exactly allow much room for multicolor nonsense, so a lot of the cool and unique 3-color cards won't be showing up in these update videos. They're obviously awesome for someone out there, just not for us. That being said, if you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe for more update videos like this, and if you're new to the realm of digital cubing on Arena, come join our Discord in the links below to get in on the action yourself. It's also worth noting that we've been able to provide gem codes to our participants on a weekly basis due to our partnership with Matcherino, so if you're interested in hearing more, you know where to find us. Alright, without further ado, let's take a look at what the streets have to offer. Wait a second, what happened to the white cards? Well, do you remember just a second ago when I said this is a heavy 3-color set? Turns out, because of the multicolor angle eating up most of the design space for Capenna, there wasn't as much design space for great monocolored cards left over in the set. In fact, we're not trying out any new white cards for the Unrestricted Cube, and a total of 5 cards across blue, black, and red. Peasant Cube picked up its fair share of slam dunk commons and uncommons, but yeah, we're not getting too much for Unrestricted Cube outside of green, which we'll get to in a minute. So, with that behind us, let's peek at some of the cards in the Maestro Shard that caught our attention. The first one's a no-brainer that we've already discussed in the Peasant Cube update. Make Disappear is simply a strict upgrade to Quench, which has long been a tier 2 counterspell that we play for density reasons. Quench sits at the bottom end of playable counterspells, just barely edging out whatever the next best option would be, and while it can be a letdown in the late game, it still does an effective job at trading 1-for-1 with a spell during the first 3 to 5 turns of the game. Blue control and tempo decks just need to be able to keep up with the fast starts from creature decks, and there can only be one memory lapse or counter spell, so you have to fill out that slot somehow. It remains to be seen how often casualty will matter on Make Disappear, but even if it only comes up 1 in every 10 games, it's still added functionality to a card we're already playing. We were pretty hyped for Overcharged Amalgam when it came out, and while we still agree that it's a good card, it's pretty obvious that our blue decks don't often have expendable creatures on board, so casualty on a blue card doesn't sound as appealing as it reads. Still, being given the option to sack a creature to all but guarantee a critical spell doesn't resolve will matter from time to time, so it's a fine upgrade to a begrudgingly playable card. I don't think either of us were blown away by Ledger Shredder, but it is a cheap creature with a pretty high ceiling, so I'm making the push to at least test it out. Connive is a bit tricky, having played with it a little bit at this point. You get free loots, which is nice, but you're pushed into wanting to grow the creature, which means discarding non-land cards. Typically, you want to be looting away lands, not spells, but Connive gives you an incentive to bin your spells instead, so cards like Ledger Shredder key heavily off cards that want to be binned, like Flashback or Escape cards. You can prompt the 2 spells in 1 turn ability yourself if you have a low enough curve, but the bird also triggers off your opponent casting multiple spells in a turn, which should happen from time to time. The baseline of a 1/3 flyer isn't great, but it only takes a single counter to make it worth the cost, and it should be easy to set up a turn 3 play of the Ledger Shredder into a cheap cantrip or shock to grow the bird immediately, and from there it threatens to become a 3/5, 4/6, or even bigger. I've actually had my hands on this card in our most recent Unrestricted Cube draft, and I can say the name is quite appropriate. The card definitely shreds through the library. Speculation's the name of the game here, with Shakedown Heavy being another card that will likely fall into one of 2 categories, huge overperformer or huge disappointment. It's an overstated beater with a Punisher mechanic that lets your opponent decide between taking a large chunk of damage or putting you up a card. Notably, there are no restrictions on block in with Shakedown Heavy, so it plays defense exceptionally well for the cost. We envision this as a beater for our black aggro decks where you're never really disappointed no matter what the results of the card is. My 3-drop got in for 6 damage? Awesome. My opponent chose not to take the damage and now I'm up a card and I have a 6/4 blocker? Cool, I'll take that. Oh, what's that? My opponent answered my 6/4 with a removal spell and I never got anything out of it? That sounds fine to me, it was only a 3-drop in the first place. It's really hard to imagine things going too wrong with the card, but even so, it might just be that black aggro decks want to push damage, and giving the opponent an out to avoiding that damage ends up being more of a detriment than we're thinking. Guess we'll see how it all shakes out. Everyone loves a good underdog story, and we've got a zinger for you right here. Tenacious Underdog is pretty easy to grok, well statted, 2-drop for aggressive black decks with a repeatable recursive ability that puts you up on cards. Yep, nothing to hate on here. We've seen our recursive black creatures pull a metric ton of weight in supporting black aggro and sacrifice alike, and here we've got a 3-2 for 2 that says anytime you have 4 mana and some life to spare, and you've got nothing better going on, you have access to a hasty 3-2 that trades off for a card at end of turn. The life adds up, but generally speaking, you should be killing your opponent faster than this kills you, and remember that Blitz will draw you a card even if the body dies to something else before the end step, so you can sacrifice it to another effect for extra value and access to your card right away. Consider this one of the obvious big hitters from New Capenna. Our last card in the Maestro spectrum is one of the premium commons from the set, Strangle, a single red mana to deal 3 to a creature or planeswalker at sorcery speed. Efficient and kinky, you gotta love it. You can't dog the card too hard for being a sorcery, and notably it doesn't bolt the opponent's face, but 3 damage for 1 mana is about as efficient as it gets in our card pool, so we're not asking for too much more here. Notably, we've mentioned how this card feels a bit too efficient at the peasant level, but it actually feels right at home in the Unrestricted Cube. Green was the big winner from New Capenna with a whopping 4 cards to make the cut. Gala Greeters isn't the most intrinsically powerful of the bunch, but we like the package of effects this is advertising. You can't double up on effects during the same turn, but having every creature you play or token you create come stapled with 2 life, a treasure token, or a +1/+1 counter for the Greeters is nice value over a longer game. As noted in our podcast review of the set, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to it, there's a link to the podcast down below, Gala Greeters reads more explicitly like a green-white secret gold card, since that's the deck capable of spitting out the most bodies, but our Selesnya Tokens deck could use a few more payoffs in the monocolored sections, so we're cool with it. It could be that the combination of effects is a bit too slow, especially with the treasure token being gated to creating tapped treasures, but there's enough flexibility here to see how it stacks up against the competition. Titan of Industry is the most explosive card of the bunch in terms of raw power, which is what you should expect of a 7-drop that makes it into one of these videos. We wouldn't be talking about an expensive creature like this unless it did something truly fantastic, and yeah, the Titan delivers. You get 2 of 4 options on ETB, ranging from making a 4/4 token to gaining some life or naturalizing a permanent, and even possibly getting a shield counter if you feel like protecting your investment. At base level, you should think about this as 7 mana for 11 points worth of power and toughness, and your choice of additional upside. We've compared this card to Hornet Queen in terms of stabilizing power, and while Hornet Queen's just a slight bit better at ensuring you don't die, Titan of Industry isn't that far off, all while being a much more proactive threat if you're at parity or already ahead in the game. Either way, this should be a heavy hitter and instantly becomes one of Green's best ramp targets in our card pool. It's going to be hard to talk about Workshop Warchief without drawing parallels to Thragtusk, the card it was obviously based on. For what it's worth, the design is clearly aimed as a callback to Thragtusk, but they're different enough that we believe they can coexist in the cube without treading on each other's toes. Thragtusk is best suited as a green sideboard card for aggro matchups or a splash for blue-white base blink decks. Thragtusk is a top-notch blink target, which can't be said of Workshop Warchief, since the Rhino Chief's token to make it ability is on death, not just leaving the battlefield. Thragtusk also gives a bigger life buffer on ETB. Now, Warchief is a bit more gnarly of a beater, as it picks up trample, and the token it leaves behind is bigger. Trust us, a 4/4 is much bigger improvement over a 3/3 than it sounds like. The huge selling point for the Warchief is the Blitz ability, which lets you smash immediately without giving up board presence, since you'll sacrifice the Rhino and leave behind the 4/4, not to mention you still gain the 3 life upon entering, and even draw a card for your trouble due to Blitz. It's a bit expensive to Blitz, but the base card is already powerful enough that it's all upside. Again, this is less of a Thragtusk replacement than it is a rock-solid green beater. You'll know when you're drafting whether you want one or the other, but rarely will you want both. This last green card is my spicy sleeper hit of the set. Maybe fight rigging ends up being a complete dud, but I have high hopes on this one. We've seen the add a counter every turn text be quite strong on a number of different cards, such as Luminarch Aspirant and Ranger class, and fight rigging gives you that ability stapled to an enchantment with the possibility of free rolling a big spell later in the game. Now, here's the thing. Hideaway isn't guaranteed to matter every game. For one, you could just flat out brick on Hideaway and not see anything worth really casting once you've met the 7 power threshold, and even worse, you'll play plenty of games where you just never land a 7 power creature. In those instances, you're still getting a +1/+1 counter every combat, including the turn you play it, and it helps build your threats up to the point where you can cast the Hideaway spell. Where I really like this card is alongside large creatures which can come down and immediately fulfill the condition, allowing you to do some pretty absurd stuff. It's not too hard to imagine landing Elder Gargaroth, going to combat and growing it to 7 power with your fight rigging, and then free rolling another big fatty into place. Even in the fail case, you're still getting something, and the best case scenarios are pretty huge. Maybe it ends up being too gimmicky or misses too often, but I'm eager to rig the fight in this card's favor. We've only got one gold card to talk about here due to the nature of the set, but it's a winner. Ob Nixilis is back donning his best Mafia attire, and he's here to make your games obnoxious and your opponents miserable. We talked about this card extensively in our latest podcast episode, so I'll try to keep things brief. Casting this flat out on 3 mana is fine. You make a devil, you start ticking up after that, your opponent's life total dwindles until they're forced to discard cards, and you profit. Casting this card on turn 3 with Casualty is absurd. There's a plethora of 3 power 2-drops in black that curve into Ob Nixilis, and having the Casualty copy come down with 3 loyalty is going to put the opponent in a bind very quickly. I don't know if you've ever played against Devil tokens or not, but 2 Devil tokens on turn 3 makes it very hard to get through on a Planeswalker. Once you've locked up defenses for your Ob Nixilis twins, it's uptick city from there on out, and your opponent's life total plummets. You're talking 4 damage a turn, and your opponent can't realistically discard cards that early in the game because they likely need their resources to try to deal with the Planeswalkers. I've played with this card a little bit, and my experience tells me that if you haven't already established a board by the time double Ob Nixilis shows up, the game is probably over. Hopefully it won't be a complete disaster for our cube, but Ob Nixilis might be the most potent Planeswalker printed since Oko, and that's not really a good thing. For now, it's too cool and unique not to play, and it feels like there are tools to combat it, but we'll have to keep an eye on it to see if it's too unfair for the environment. Let's wrap things up with the completed cycle of Triomes. Yes, I know they have individual names based on the family leaders, and yes, I and everyone else are going to continue referring to them as Triomes. My hot take from last year was that Capenna would not feature the remaining Triomes due to the presence of Cycling and the flavor of a world that needed Triomes, but it seems Wizards found a workaround for both of those problems, and I couldn't be happier to be wrong. Triomes are amazing for Cube, even for us where the land types aren't anything significant. They allow players the room to brew a little bit more with 3-color decks and splashes, while also naturally upping the amount of dual lands in the cube. After all, the green-black drafter is probably just as happy picking up Ziatora's Proving Grounds as the Jund player is. I think adding the initial wave of Triomes was an easy net positive for our cube, even though we had some reservations about 4 and 5-color players ruining the draft experience. Turns out that hasn't been a huge factor, and we're not as cautious this go around. Better mana fixing all around can't be that bad. Alright, that's it folks. Sorry if you were expecting more, but as I said, the 3-color nature of Capenna clashes a bit with the way our cubes have been designed, and we're not interested in reworking the cubes to make some marginally interesting 3-color cards work out. I'll bet cards like the Charms and the Family Leaders have a place in a number of arena cubes, just not ours, and that's perfectly fine. We still get a small batch of new cards to work with, and we've got a much wider swath of interesting cards to choose from for the Peasant Cube. As always, if you think we missed something, and we often do, come sound off in the Discord linked below. We run weekly drafts through Arena using the Discord, and it's a great place to hang out and chat with fellow cubers. You can also find our more extensive set review on the Deep Dive podcast linked below if you're into more in-depth discussion about cards that didn't make the list. Alright, thanks for hanging out and hope to hear from y'all soon. As always, my name is Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming. We'll see you next time.